The Ludendorff Bridge loomed ahead like a rusted spine over the Rhine, its skeletal beams swaying from artillery vibrations. American columns approached fast, infantry on foot, jeeps kicking dust, and behind them the true spearhead, the newly deployed M26 Pershing tanks. It was March 7, 1945, and the unthinkable had happened just 2 days earlier. The bridge had been captured intact. Time was now the only enemy. And at the very front of General Patton's armored thrust, just 50 meters before the ramp, the lead Pershing rumbled, then stopped. Smoke hissed out from the engine hatch. The vehicle commander stood up, waved frantically, then ducked as an incoming shell whistled overhead. Radio traffic crackled. "We're blocked. Lead tank dead. Whole columns blind." The bridge couldn't take hours of stationary weight. Its structural integrity was already compromised. Worse, the Germans had spotted movement. Spotters from the far shore were reporting to artillery teams. If the column didn't move now, the next shells wouldn't miss. In less than 5 minutes, the Rhine crossing could become a mass grave. From the second tank, a wiry corporal jumped down. Name, Corporal Raymond Harold, 23, Missouri-born, Red Ball Express-trained mechanic. He didn't wait for orders. He dropped his toolkit, slammed open the Pershing side panel, and vanished beneath its steel belly. Around him, engines roared, boots stomped, and curses flew. He didn't speak, he just listened. A deep, choking wheeze told him enough. It wasn't a catastrophic failure. It was fuel intake pressure collapse, a clogged valve. Fixable, but not under fire. Not in 90 seconds. Not unless you didn't care about dying. Mortar fire hit 30 meters to the left. Dirt and shrapnel rained down. Harold kept working. A wrench clanked onto his boot. His arm slipped on coolant. Someone screamed, "Move the damn thing!" But he didn't even flinch. He pulled a wire, rerouted pressure, and jammed a locking pin in backward. It wasn't regulation, but it might hold for 5 minutes. Above him, the tank commander called out, "You alive down there?" No answer. Just one final plying of the engine cover, and then Harold rolled out, face black with oil and eyes locked forward. "Try it," he shouted. The engine whined, then turned, then roared. The entire column erupted in cheers that were instantly drowned by a renewed barrage. The Pershing lurched forward, then the next, then the next. Like a metal snake uncurling across the last artery into Germany, the line advanced. Behind them, the engineer didn't climb back into a vehicle. He walked, limping, burned, bleeding, but smiling. He had bought them minutes, and minutes in that moment were the difference between crossing a river and being buried under it. What no one realized was that German bombers were already en route. Luftwaffe recon had identified the column hours ago. Had the tanks stalled just 10 minutes longer, the bridge would have been a death trap. But because of one man, one oil-drenched tool roll, and a valve jammed shut with a knife handle, Patton's armor crossed in time. Harold wasn't mentioned in the reports. His name isn't in the museums. But every tread that hit the far bank did so on the back of his fix. The war didn't pause for heroes. It just drove over them, if they got the engine started. As the Pershings thundered across the Ludendorff Bridge, the roar of their engines blended with the groaning steel beneath them. The bridge, never meant to carry this much armored weight, began to tremble under the pressure. Engineers watching from the far bank braced for collapse. But the column kept moving, 30 tons at a time. And at the center of that motion was a repair made in mud, blood, and instinct. Behind the line, medics rushed to patch up shrapnel wounds from the earlier barrage. But no one tended to the man who made it all possible. Corporal Harold had already disappeared into the column's dust. On the eastern bank, the lead tank crews spotted German forces falling back. They had expected a stalled crossing. They had artillery in place, but they weren't ready for armor to arrive this fast. The timing shattered their defense matrix. Roadblocks weren't laid. Anti-tank squads weren't dug in. By the time they readjusted, the Pershings were already in the town streets, rotating turrets, clearing out resistance. This wasn't just a river crossing. This was an armored spearhead punching into the last open artery of the collapsing Reich. And it had all hinged on a jammed fuel valve, bent into place with a screwdriver. Back in HQ, Patton reviewed field reports. Nothing stood out. "Rhine crossing on schedule," one line said. He nodded, assuming the machines had functioned as intended. No one mentioned the stall. No one knew the column had nearly been lost to a $5 malfunction. That's how war rights itself. It remembers victories, not what almost ruined them. If Harold had failed, the tanks would have clogged the approach. The Luftwaffe bombers, already in the air, would have made scrap metal out of them. The bridge would have collapsed under static load and fire. Germany might have bought itself weeks. But that didn't happen. The tanks crossed. The bridge held for just long enough. The Western Allies surged forward. Berlin came into range. And in every command tent and war map briefing that followed, no one realized that a mechanic, not a general, had saved the timetable. These are the moments war historians call logistics. But logistics is not a word. It is a man crawling beneath a tank while shells fall, turning a wrench with shaking hands, knowing no one will ever know his name. Corporal Harold wasn't a symbol. He was a moving part, and he never stopped moving. After the crossing, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave out. On March 17th, 10 days after the crossing, it collapsed into the Rhine, taking several engineers with it. The news made headlines. Patton's crossing did not. By then, everyone had moved on. Harold? He was reassigned to another unit. His next job? Fixing jeeps. He never mentioned the bridge again. Years later, when asked about Remagen, he simply replied, "It ran hot. I cooled it down." That was all. That's how ghosts speak, not with grandeur, but with grease on their hands. What remains of the bridge today is steel and silence. Tourists walk along what's left of the support towers. They read plaques about Patton, about strategy, about rapid advance. But somewhere buried in the gears of military history, there's a moment no plaque mentions. A single turn of a single tool, beneath a burning tank, while the whole war balanced on whether or not an engine would start. That moment had a name. It was Raymond Harold. But history doesn't record the grease, only the glory.
In the days that followed the Rhine crossing, Allied momentum exploded. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge and the rapid deployment of armored units into Germany's industrial heartland shattered what remained of the Wehrmacht's defensive cohesion. Yet within this surge of maps and maneuvers, no one paused to reflect on the men who weren't decorated or named. The mechanics, the drivers, the radio operators who did the work that generals took credit for. Among them, somewhere near the Moselle, Corporal Raymond Harold was once again beneath a vehicle. This time it was a supply truck. No crowds, no cheers, just mud and the ticking pressure of a front that never waited. Harold's field report from Remagen was lost in the sea of after-action summaries. No official commendation was filed. No superior wrote of his decision to act without orders. His commanding officer, when asked about the crossing, simply noted that the column proceeded as planned, minor delay resolved. That line, minor delay, was all history ever said about the moment when everything almost failed. But Harold didn't mind. He didn't sign up for medals. He signed up because he was a mechanic before the war, and he thought tanks needed fixing. The war just made the stakes bigger. But the work stayed the same. Soldiers remembered him, though. The commander of that stalled Pershing tank, Sergeant Alan Greaves, never forgot. Years later, in a bar in Kansas, he told his grandson, "The reason I lived through that war, some kid with a wrench who never said a damn word." Others in the column told stories of the moment the engine roared back to life. Some added fire and heroism, others underplayed it. But the constant was always the same. Harold got the engine going. No one else could have done it. And he never bragged. Not once. Not in letters home, not in post-war reunions. He left the story in the dirt beside the Rhine. Back home in Missouri, Harold returned to civilian life without ceremony. He worked in a garage for 32 years. No one who brought their car in knew they were being helped by the man who kept Patton's spearhead alive. Some veterans became politicians. Some opened businesses. Harold fixed transmissions. On his workshop wall, there were no medals, just a worn black-and-white photo of a tank. When asked once what it meant, he replied, "That one almost didn't make it." And that was it. He lived quietly, died quietly, and left behind a legacy invisible to those who only read the big headlines. Meanwhile, military historians wrote volumes about Remagen. They analyzed river currents, bridge construction, tank deployment rates, Luftwaffe delays, and Eisenhower strategy maps. They quoted generals, cited divisions, marked positions on grayscale maps. But in all those writings, there was no footnote for the man under the engine. It was as if he never existed. That's how wars are remembered, by the movements of armies, not by the heartbeat of one man sweating beneath steel while the world holds its breath. But history is wrong to forget him, because the war did not turn on speeches or medals. It turned on whether a single tank could move right now. There are thousands of Harolds, men and women whose hands made the war winnable, who never stood in front of cameras or at victory parades. Cooks who fed starving units, nurses who patched together torn bodies, code breakers who never told their families what they did, mechanics who used wire and willpower to keep machines moving forward. They don't appear in documentaries. Their stories don't sell books. But without them, the war would have stalled. The engines of victory weren't just in tanks. They were in the hands of the ordinary. And sometimes those hands turned wrenches that saved entire columns from disappearing into smoke. Somewhere on the Italian front, a different mechanic, Private Luis Ortega, spent the night before Anzio crawling through mud to fix a Stuart light tank that had taken shrapnel to its fuel line. He wasn't under fire, not that night, but the cold and the wet made the wrench slip from his hands again and again. The tank rolled again before dawn, joining the armored push. No one ever asked who fixed it. The platoon commander credited logistics, but it was Ortega who kept the steel moving. Just like Harold at Remagen, he had become part of a quiet brotherhood, men whose contribution was measured not in rank or ribbons, but in rotation per minute. Across the Channel, during the Normandy breakout, Sergeant Walter Eng from the 761st Tank Battalion once welded a track back onto a Sherman using an improvised acetylene torch made from wreckage.
It held for 19 miles, enough to get them through the hedgerows and into the next town. That fix? It saved a platoon from being flanked. He too got nothing for it. His name was logged in supply maintenance, not in after-action reports. Like Harold, like Ortega, Walter's battle wasn't against men. It was against time, metal, and the brutal indifference of war machines. They didn't kill to win the war. They kept it moving. This is how victory is made, not only by those who charge forward, but by those who prevent the wheels from locking up. For every general in a photo, there are 100 mechanics whose faces are lost to time. When we watch grainy footage of tanks rolling through ruins, we see motion, but not the nights it took to restore that motion. No battle plan survives without mobility. No tank column survives without service. Harold didn't just save a vehicle. He preserved the momentum of an entire theater, and that momentum became the wall that crushed the Third Reich from the west. Mechanics like these carried strange burdens. They knew the weight of every bolt, every misfire, every second wasted. Their tools were dirty, but their responsibility was surgical. If a tank didn't start, it wasn't just a delay. It could mean an entire squad getting cut down, or artillery missing its timing. And yet no ceremony awaited them. No trumpet sounded when an engine roared back to life. These were victories without witnesses, but they happened every day, in jungles, in deserts, on frozen roads in Belgium. The clank of metal under their hands was the pulse of Allied advance. Harold never met Ortega. Eng never heard of Harold. They were shadows to each other, moving in parallel lines. But in the archive of war's unseen moments, they stand side by side. Theirs is a story told not in speeches, but in grease-stained uniforms and makeshift tools. They were the last to sleep, the first to move, the ones who got called only when something failed. They did not choose glory. Glory forgot them, but war never could. Because every time a tank moved forward, every time a bridge was reached on time, every time steel roared into enemy lines, their hands were already there. And now, decades later, tourists visit memorials for great offensives. They hear names like Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery. They read plaques about strategy, maps, and breakthroughs. But the stories that matter most are buried deeper, not in marble, but in rust, not in medals, but in the echo of a wrench turning beneath enemy skies. The war was won not just by commanders who knew where to go, but by men like Harold who made sure we could get there at all. Their war was never famous, but it was essential, because without the man under the tank never moves. In the spring of 1946, as Europe began stitching itself back together, medals were mailed, ceremonies were held, statues were commissioned. Politicians lined up to shake hands with generals. Victory was no longer a dream. It had been branded into history with parades and photographs. Yet men like Harold never stood on platforms. They returned to the same towns they had left, with no fanfare. Their stories, no less heroic, didn't fit into the headlines. What could a press release say? Mechanic fixes engine under pressure? It doesn't stir the blood like hero stormed a bunker. And so history turned the page without ever reading the margin. When authors wrote books about Remagen, they focused on the engineers who captured the bridge, the officers who pushed for the crossing, and the Luftwaffe's too-late reaction. Diagrams were drawn of bridge structure, bomb craters, and river currents, but no chapter was titled "The Kid Who Fixed the Pershing." His name was absent, his presence invisible. And in that absence lies a deeper truth about war. It is not remembered in proportion to sacrifice. It is remembered in proportion to spectacle. And Harold, like thousands of others, was spectacularly unspectacular. That's why the war was won, because the boring jobs got done. Decades passed, new wars came, new mechanics served, and still the pattern held. Historians praised strategy, documentaries replayed combat footage, interviews showcased officers and snipers. But if you asked a retired tanker who kept them alive, they never said a general. They said, "My mechanic." There is something sacred about that trust, the belief that no matter how far you go into hell, someone behind you can pull you out with a wrench and a prayer. Harold earned that trust, not through words, but through grease, fire, and silence. He was the kind of soldier who didn't need to be told the war depended on him. He already knew. The Army never created a medal for essential maintenance under pressure, no ribbon for preventing catastrophic delay. And yet those moments often meant more than any assault. One tank moves on time, a village is spared. One bridge is reached before demolition, an entire corps survives. Harold didn't think about this when he worked. He thought about bolts, torque, and fuel flow. But in hindsight, his instinct to act, fast and alone, became the hinge on which a battle turned. He didn't need to be thanked. He just needed the engine to run. That was his battlefield. In Missouri, Harold's workshop was sold a few years after his death. The new owners painted over the walls. They found an old box tucked behind a shelf. Inside, a photo of the Ludendorff Bridge, a rusted dog tag, and a folded American flag. There was no note, no explanation, just silence. The past had returned to dust, as it always does. But maybe someone, someday, would wonder why that photo mattered. Maybe they'd trace it back to the moment a tank moved when it wasn't supposed to. And maybe they'd realize that victory isn't always about who fires the last shot, but who fixes the machine that fires it. These are not dramatic endings. There are no last stands, no heroic deaths, no trumpet solos. Just a man, under a tank, doing his job while others moved forward. But war, real war, is made of such moments, quiet, crucial, forgotten. And so long as we only honor the loudest stories, we will misunderstand the price of victory. It was not paid solely in blood. It was paid in silence, in skill, in sacrifice without applause. Men like Harold didn't just support the war, they were the war. And their names deserve more than footnotes. They deserve our memory. In every conflict, there are names etched into monuments, and there are names etched only into the machinery they kept alive. Harold T. Greaves was the latter. No military parade ever echoed his name. No photograph captured him mid-action. Yet his imprint was burned into the steel of a Pershing tank that roared when it shouldn't have. He didn't win the war with a rifle. He won it with instinct, improvisation, and dirty hands. He fixed a machine that was blocking an entire crossing, and in doing so moved history forward when it risked collapsing into delay. That moment, silent as it was, thundered through the entire campaign. The war never waited for perfect plans. It moved forward on the backs of men who acted without orders. Harold didn't hesitate. He didn't file a report or ask permission. He crawled under the beast in mud and smoke and did what needed to be done. That one act, executed without recognition or witness, allowed Patton's armor to keep advancing. The result? A critical window opened. German demolition teams failed by minutes. Allied troops reached the east bank of the Rhine ahead of schedule. But the world would only hear about the bold crossing, not the man who made it physically possible. That's the tragedy and the purity of his role. Tragic because no medals were forged for battlefield repairs under fire. Pure because he didn't need one. He knew the stakes. He didn't need applause, just a working engine. His war wasn't glory, it was utility. And utility wins wars. While others fired shots, he fired up steel. While others calculated risk, he became the solution. Not because he was ordered to, but because that's who he was. The war machine wasn't fueled just by gasoline. It was fueled by people like him, unnoticed, unthanked, but undeniable. Years later, in a small Missouri garage, his tools rusted in silence. There were no memoirs, no plaques, just a folded flag in a drawer, a photo of a bridge, and one old wrench kept cleaner than the rest. No one who passed by would guess the scale of what he had done. That's how quiet heroes leave the world, without ceremony, but with consequences. His story never made it into textbooks, but the tank that crossed and the soldiers it carried did. And somewhere inside every victory we remember is a single forgotten mechanic who made it possible. Every tank that roared into Germany carried more than firepower. It carried the sweat and sacrifice of invisible soldiers like Harold. They didn't stop bullets. They stopped time from running out. The war was won in headlines, yes, but it was fought and fixed in oil-stained silence. If we forget men like him, we forget how war truly works. It's not just the trigger pulled that matters. It's the bolt tightened, the tread replaced, the engine restarted at the last possible second. These aren't stories that make generals famous, but they are the reasons generals win. So maybe he didn't make history in the official sense, but he made it move. He made it run. And long after the bridge was taken, long after the battles ended, that moment remained, unseen but unshakable. A soldier under a tank, a problem solved, a war nudged forward. No monument carries his name, but if you ever hear an engine rumble to life after all hope was lost, that sound, that moment, that's Harold.